If the weapon merely suggests targets to a human being who then decides which targets to engage and actually engages them, so a human-in-the-loop autonomous weapon system, perhaps we'd tolerate something with a higher failure rate. But if the weapon is actually making the decision to engage, at the very least, it would have to perform as well as a human being, perhaps higher than a human being. Can an autonomous weapon apply the requirements of distinction? This is an issue that you will hear raised, if you haven't already, often. Only lawful military objectives can be targeted. An easy answer is we don't know yet. We just haven't seen the technology, how it can perform. But we can also think of certain weapons that, because of this very difficult problem, only target weapons, for example, or only target objects. If we have such a weapon, then perhaps the distinction issue is reduced in its importance. What about proportionality? Can an algorithm ever assess whether expected collateral damage is excessive in relation to the concrete military advantage anticipated? This is a key discussion area. I'm sure other panel members will talk about it. Some say yes, some say no. Many say that sensor packages on drones these days make them actually better at providing information into this process than the human eye would. We have even some scientists asserting, and I don't have a position on this, that an autonomous weapon could perhaps perform a proportionality analysis better than a human. The reason being that the emotion would be stripped away from the decision. What about surrender? Obviously, it's unlawful to have a no-quarter policy. That said, you are not obliged to give the enemy the opportunity to surrender. If the enemy is surrendering, that enemy is hors de combat and can no longer be attacked. Again, how this issue comes up, how it's dealt with, the importance of it will depend on the concept of operations of the autonomous weapon. If it's functioning like a dumb bomb or a smart bomb and simply attacking a particular area, then perhaps the surrender issue drops away. And finally, I think we always need to bear in mind, even if we do have a weapon system that is performing functions short of the actual targeting decision, so a weapon system with a human in the loop, we've got to be careful about certain psychological situations. One of them is the situation of scenario fulfillment. That is where a human operator of a weapon will take in certain data, and then the psychology will be to fill in the gaps in the data to create a story, perhaps recreate a training scenario. And you may have heard of the Vincennes incident. That may be an example of scenario fulfillment at work, if you agree with the BBC, which covered that incident in part. So those were my comments. Thanks very much.
Bonjour, merci. Good morning, and thank you for having me. It's a real honor and pleasure to be here. I want to thank Dr. Patrick for the invitation to come to speak with you and for the time that I'll be able to spend with you. What I'm going to do is for about the next 25 minutes, I will do three things. First, I'll tell you a little bit about DARPA, what our mission is, and in particular, what some of the work that we're doing in the neurosciences looks like. Then secondly, I'm going to dive down in and give you some detail on one particular neuroscience program that we run called Narrative Networks that helps us understand the impact of stories and narratives on human behavior. In this session, measure those impacts. And then finally, the third thing I'll do is talk about and ethics review process that we have in place at DARPA that helps us ensure that we're taking into account the ethical and legal and social implications of the technologies that we're developing, so we can develop them in a morally praiseworthy way rather than in a way that wouldn't allow us to sleep well at night. Okay, so I'll spend about 7 or 8 minutes doing each of those things. So let's first start with what is DARPA. So I don't think I can clear the bar of John's very kind and generous introduction. I will say that DARPA is the Department of Defense's blue sky research and development organization. That is, we are chartered to invest in science and technology that will revolutionize the kinds of capabilities we can bring to bear in the national security domain. And those capabilities serve not just the United States, but our allies and partners, and through the Article 5 obligations that we have to NATO, Canada. So in other words, Canadians benefit from the investments that U.S. DARPA organizations makes in developing technology that can help our soldiers win wars more quickly, or hopefully prevent them from ever occurring. In order to execute that mission, in order to prevent our adversaries from strategically surprising us, and in order to create capabilities that surprise an adversary, prevent them from ever becoming an adversary in the first place, DARPA invests in multiple kinds of technologies. So I sit inside of an office called the Biological Technologies Office, or BTO. It's the newest office inside of DARPA. It was carved out by our current director, Dr. R.T. Prabhakar, to focus on the application of biological science to things like helping us understand how to better prevent traumatic brain injury and post-traumatic stress disorder. Help us understand how to better vaccinate vulnerable populations, including our soldiers, so that they aren't vulnerable to disease when they deploy. To help us better understand how we use our understanding of the brain to develop more effective training and education methods, so that we can teach a soldier how to do her job in less time and with less taxpayer money. So those are the kinds of things that we do inside of the Biological Technologies Office. A lot of the programs that we run are part and parcel of President Obama's BRAIN initiative. And focusing on that was the thing that first brought Dr. Packard and I together at the conference at MIT that you mentioned. So the BRAIN initiative, it's a contrived acronym, stands for Brain Research through Advancing Innovative Neurotechnologies. And this is a $100 million a year program that President Obama has started to help us explore the area of basic neuroscience and apply it to things like learning foreign languages, creating understanding across cultural barriers, developing prosthetics for people who have lost limbs, and so on, right? All of these technologies oriented around using our better understanding of the brain to help us understand things like pathological brain conditions. So we have several brain-related programs inside of DARPA BTO. They include things like subnets, another contrived acronym. This is a DoD agency, so we love, acronyms. And subnets is a program that Dr. Justin Sanchez, one of my colleagues in BTO, runs. What it does is it observes that we've had several hundred years of science wrapped around the idea of understanding things like mental illness. And yet, the approaches that we use to think about mental illness, like post-traumatic stress disorder and other DSM-5 diagnosable mental illnesses, have generally been nonspecific. That is, our interventions are either gross, they are pharmacological, for instance, they don't target the parts of the brain that are actually dysfunctional, or they are at a remove. That is, we have talking cures or cognitive behavioral therapy, things like that, that can help us go some way towards alleviating mental illness, but that don't get us all the way towards it. So if we can develop technologies that allow us to dive down into the brain and understand at the cellular level and below how the multiple levels of organization in the brain interact to produce a mental illness, then just maybe we could develop a breakthrough therapy that might allow us to address mental illness and brain injury. Okay, a targeted, specific therapy that's much more effective than a drug that's non-specific in its effects or the talking cure. So subnets is working with populations like schizophrenic individuals, for instance, who are undergoing brain surgery anyhow, to see if we can use implantable devices to understand what's happening inside the brain at a distributed scale and at the atomic scale. That is the level of the neuron and below. And so if this program is successful, it could help us develop entirely new methods for treating mental illness that might be much more effective than anything we've seen in the history of humanity, to be frank. So that's one example of the type of investments that we make in DARPA in the neuroscience space in support of the brain initiatives. There are others, including the RAM program, so there's another acronym for you. That stands for Restoring Access to Memory. So this program has focused on developing what are essentially memory prosthetics. So if you have a soldier who's experienced multiple concussive events on the battlefield, and that's led to damage in the hippocampus, which is one of the brain structures that's responsible for storage of long-term memory, then maybe what we can do is, if we understand the neural code in that part of the brain, perhaps we can intervene and restore a missing memory. Allow that soldier to be able to recognize a loved one even after a traumatic brain injury. And so that's another program that we've launched as part of the Brain Initiative, and it's designed to help us understand the neural correlates of memory and develop memory prosthetics that might allow us to restore missing memories or otherwise jump the gap that you get by having traumatic brain injury both on and off the battlefield. So that's a quick overview of what DARPA is and does and what I do in the Biological Technologies Office in some of the programs in the neuroscience space we've invested in. Let me now move to my second 7 minutes and talk to you a little bit about one program in particular that will open up a new avenue of exploration for us. So it doesn't deal with autonomous vehicles and autonomous weapon systems. Rather, it is designed to help us understand how we can better communicate so as to prevent the need for conflict in the first place. So this program is called Narrative Networks. It's built upon some provocative science that's been explored in the last 10 years that is helping us understand why stories and narratives have such a dramatic impact on human behavior. So to motivate this for a bit, we know from decades of psychological study and from commonplace observation, right, that stories and narratives have a powerful impact on the things we do. So if I wanted to motivate you, for instance, to consider donating to a cancer-related charity, I might tell you a powerful story about a child who has cancer, right, and whose death is imminent unless you help us invest in cancer therapeutics and in cancer science and oncology. And those kinds of stories we know can do things like influence what you recall. Right? So if I give you a list of events in a narrative frame, rather than just randomly, you'll be far more likely to recall them weeks later. We know that those kinds of frames can influence judgments. So even fundamental judgments, like whom you think it is permissible to kill for the greater good, can be influenced by narrative frames. So how many of you are familiar with Josh Green's work in this area? Has anybody heard of Josh Green before? Okay. So Josh is a neuroscientist at Harvard University. One of the things that he did about 10 years ago was a fascinating set of experiments that leveraged what is called the footbridge problem and the trolley problem in moral philosophy. So it may be something that you've heard about before. Since you're not familiar with Josh's work, I'll spend a couple of minutes explaining that to you so it makes sense. So let's say, just imagine if you will, that you're standing by a trolley track. Perhaps you're in Great Britain, and a trolley is coming down the track, and it's speeding out of control. The conductor's hair is on fire, if you will. He's putting the brakes on, but nothing is happening. You can see that happening, and you can see that. And as the trolley speeds down the track, you notice that it's about to strike 5 children who are playing on the track. And you also notice that you're standing by a junction box, and that if you reach down and throw a lever, you can divert the trolley from that track onto another end, where it will only strike 1 child who is playing. So you shout at the children, they don't hear you, you don't have time to run out onto the track, but you can push this lever and probably save 4 children's lives. So how many of you, perhaps with regret, would push the lever? Let's have a show of hands. We can do some experimental psychology here. Okay, so it looks like 70% or so of the audience is my quick assay. That, in the non-loaded sense, normatively speaking, is about what an average population will say, somewhere around 80%. Okay? And what is operative here is good old-fashioned utilitarian reasoning, right? An action that I can take is going to prevent a greater good, and I am perhaps morally obligated to take that action, even if there may be something about it that I regret. Right? So let's now, break, consider a very different scenario. So here's the hook. Let's say you're standing on a footbridge, so you're in Japan perhaps. Here comes a train that's out of control. You can tell you don't have time to jump off the bridge, but there is a child teetering on the edge of the bridge. And you realize if you push the child off, the child will land in front of the train, and it will slow the train down enough so that it doesn't strike the 5 children playing further down from it. So, how many of you, perhaps again with regret, would push the child off the footbridge? Okay, all right, so we've got one really dirty utilitarian in here, right? All right, that's good for you sticking with your principal guns here. That response is actually a little bit depressed relative to an average population. Most people, about 20% of any given population will say, yes, with regret, I pushed the child off the bridge. So, and what's going on here, I don't mean to speak for you, but I suspect there's just utilitarian calculations going on in your head again about what action can I take that will have the best possible outcome, all things considered, in that circumstance. Now, what accounts for the dramatic difference in this room, and I know it's a Gedanken, a thought experiment, but what accounts for the dramatic difference, even just in this room, about whom you think it's permissible to kill for the greater good in that context? Philosophers have gone round and round for many decades, leveraging something like the difference between killing and letting die, or the principle of double effect. These may be doctrines you're familiar with, to help explain that distinction. But psychologically, that hasn't done a good job of explaining why people answer differently the way they do. What Green did was he took people and asked them similar kinds of questions while he was scanning their brains in a functional magnetic resonance imaging machine. So this gives us a blood oxygen level dependent signal from the brain that serves as a good proxy for neural activity, so that we can tell what parts of your brain are active when you're doing things like making judgments about whom you think it is permissible to allow to die in these 2 cases. And what he discovered was that in the first case, the trolley problem, that parts of the brain related to working memory and calculation of consequence were brought online because of the structure of the story and the words used in it. In the second case, the footbridge problem, parts of the brain related to the processing of emotions and related to theory of mind. That is, to the capacity we have to think about the mental states of others. What's that boy going to think about, or that girl going to think about as I push him or her off, were brought online by the structure of the story and the words that I used. Even though it's very difficult to find a principled philosophic distinction between the 2 cases. So that's proof of principle, right? That something as fundamental as a story can cause a dramatic delta in your fundamental judgments about whom you think it's permissible to kill. And for that reason, we're interested in stories from a national security perspective, right? It's highly likely that the stories that warring parties tell each other might make it more difficult for us to cause peace and reconciliation to occur in any given circumstance. It's highly likely that the stories that someone like Sheikh Hussein Nasrallah, the spiritual leader of the militant wing of Lebanese Hezbollah, tells to vulnerable populations on the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, result in innocent children, right, being used in a terrorist attack. So there are all kinds of stories and narratives that it would behoove us to understand how they're impacting our brain so that we can better understand how we use words to shape the context of conflict so that the loss of innocent life and resorting to sticks and stones rather than words and phrases to resolve political disagreement becomes less likely, right? So the Narrative Networks program was started to advance the state of the art in 3 different areas. And first of all, to advance our understanding of the quantitative analysis of narratives. So what kind of tools can I develop that might tell me, for instance, what kind of stories about radicalization are being told on a jihadi website, for instance. Then, secondly, to apply those analyzed stories inside the fMRI chamber using things like electroencephalograms, passive electrodes that can sense electrical activity over the surface of your scalp, and that we can use to make inferences about the brain using, and other scientific technologies to help us understand what's going on in your brain when you hear those stories. And then finally, third, to help us build better models, simulations, and sensors of narrative influence. And the idea here would be that if I could understand what Nasrallah is telling to a Palestinian family such that they're convinced they ought to strap plastic explosives on an 8-year-old, that maybe, just maybe, I can articulate a narrative frame that allows me to transmit that there might be other ways to help you resolve political disagreements you have about the status of the occupied territories than through sacrificing an innocent person. Okay, that's the ultimate idea. So in this program, we've made all kinds of fascinating advances over the course of the last 3 years, ranging from understanding how stories and narratives influence the production of oxytocin in the brain, over to helping us understand how stories and narratives can cause reactive devaluation. That is, how certain kinds of language might cause us to value the humanity of others less in a conflict context. So let me briefly talk about the oxytocin work. So oxytocin is an evolutionarily ancient hormone that's produced naturally in your brain, so we're all producing it right now, and it drives a lot of trusting-related behavior in human beings. So I could bias, for instance, how much money you would give to a total stranger whom you don't know in an experimental economics context if I were to elevate the oxytocin production in your brain. Right? So that can be done endogenously, so I can have skin-to-skin contact with you for more than 15 seconds. So people like Paul Zak have been fascinating with experiments where they have participants go to a masseuse and get deep tissue massage. And since, again, this is an evolutionarily ancient hormone, it evolved in the context of mammalian bonding, right? So skin-on-skin contact is very important for stimulating its release. And he can show that if you go to a masseuse, you're more likely to accept an offer from a stock market investor, right, as you leave. And that oxytocin that's produced as a result of the massage kind of gives you, it's in part responsible for the phenomenology of the massage, that warm glow that you experience after a good deep tissue massage. You can also elevate oxytocin levels exogenously. So that is, I could use something like an Afrin sprayer with oxytocin suspended in saline, and you can squirt it up your nose, wait a few minutes, and that can also bias you towards things like trusting a total stranger with more money in an economics experiment. So we know that oxytocin is important for driving trusting behavior, and it also turns out, thanks to work that the Zak Lab has done, he's at Claremont Graduate University and his team, that stories and narratives can cause the release of oxytocin. So you may remember 15 minutes ago when I said perhaps I could persuade you to donate money to a cancer charity by telling you a story about a child who has cancer and who's going to pass away if you don't act. Then what the Zak Lab did was they actually used that narrative with individuals. They were able to do blood draws before they watched it and after it, since right now a blood draw is the best way to have to detect the production of oxytocin and measure it. And they were able to show that certain kinds of stories caused the endogenous release of oxytocin. And what's interesting is since oxytocin is suffuses throughout the brain, it causes secondary effects on our sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. That is, its release can cause our heart rate to vary more or to go up. And those kinds of things you can sense. You can sense them using contact technology. So things like heart rate variability meters and galvanic skin response, looking at electrical conductivity across the skin as a function of how much you sweat. And you can also sense it in a standoff fashion. So in the Narrative Networks program, for instance, we've developed a high-definition web camera that, with a certain set of filters over it, can remove all the noise in the visual spectrum of light in here, such that it focuses only on the frequencies of light affiliated with oxygenated and deoxygenated blood. So those can be seen on the surface of your face. And you can assess that from a distance and say, this person's heart rate variability has gone up as a result of watching this short story about that child with cancer. So you can then, and the ZAC Lab has done this, train a machine learning algorithm to look at that pattern of heart rate variability and forecast, potentially, while you're watching the narrative about the child, whether or not you'll be likely to donate to a cancer charity as you leave the building. And so the ZAC Lab has successfully done that. They have the algorithms that can predict for any given subject to about 80% accuracy whether or not, on a binary judgment, you'll donate as you leave the lab to a cancer charity. And also to about the same level of accuracy, they are able to forecast whether you'll be a hyper-donator. That is, whether you'll give more than half of the money you earn as a result of participating in the experiment to the Cancer Foundation as you leave. So that's proof of principle that understanding the neurobiology and affiliated biology of story-related processing can help us understand the impact of stories on human behavior. And in the Department of Defense context, we're trying to use that to understand if I produce a commercial that I air in the West Bank in an attempt to convince a parent that they ought to think twice before they allow their child to be used in a suicide bombing attack, I need to know, have I told that story in a way that generates empathy for the central characters in it, that causes that heart rate variability, such that the cognitive mechanisms that sit downstream of those emotional judgments would be influenced in a way that in our cooler moments, we can all agree they ought to be influenced, right? So that we make a world where exploitation of the innocent is less likely, and where our information operations are effective at speaking truth to the power that violent non-state organizations have to exploit peoples for the benefit of the organization and not for the individual. So that's the Narrative Networks program. There's a whole host of other work I could talk about in it, but what I'd like to do in my last 7 minutes with you instead is to talk a little bit about the moral dimensions of the technologies we developed at DARPA. So our organization, of course, is aware that technologies are not developed in a vacuum. They have political upshot. They have moral and legal upshot, obviously, or we wouldn't be here. And so we have a process, in addition to legal review and the things that Lieutenant Colonel Bolt could speak far more eloquently about, to ensure that as we develop technology, we follow those rules and laws. But we also have in place a process to help ensure that we are kickstarting the moral and ethical conversations that need to take place as we develop these. So, of course, we follow the extant fiducial obligations we have to do things like put our experimental work through institutional review boards. So anybody who works on a DARPA project that involves human subjects has to clear their work through their local university IRB. We also have a second process that sits on top of that, that's actually much more rigorous. That is called a DoD, or Department of Defense level IRB review. And there we ensure things like the individuals who participate in the experiment are fully informed that it's being funded by DARPA and the Department of Defense, and understand that it could have security upshot, that they understand the risks and benefits, that they're given every opportunity not to participate if they're uncomfortable for any reason at all, perhaps if they're a universal pacifist, for instance. So we have that second level IRB review in place that's even more tight and rigorous. So there are regimens and protocols that are approved at the first level or aren't approved at the second, okay, to ensure that if within the confines of the program, we're being true to what the demands of morality place upon us. Now, of course, there are other ethical, legal, and social issues that are much broader than merely the fact that you can pass an IRB review. To think about those, we have established inside of DARPA a neuroscience, ethical, legal, and social implications committee. So this panel is made up of 6 internationally recognized experts who join with our program managers and provide them advice at program genesis, during the execution of the project, and when you're thinking about transitioning the technologies into the national security domain, that provide them advice and counsel about what the potential upshot of this technology is from a moral perspective. So this includes people like Michael Gazzaniga at the University of California at Santa Barbara, a renowned neuroscientist who's written a couple of books about ethical issues in neuroscience. Patricia Churchland from the University of California at San Diego, who's had a couple of books on the morality of neuroscience and the neuroscience of moral judgment, neuroethics. Ellen Fox, who's the head of healthcare ethics for the Veterans Administration. James Giordano, who holds one of the few endowed chairs in neuroethics in the world at Georgetown University. Jim Cook, who's an active duty Air Force colonel and head of the philosophy department at the U.S. Air Force Academy, so a practicing professional military ethicist. People like that come together to provide wisdom and insight so that our program managers can ensure not only are they following the law, but that also they can sleep well at night. They turn over the technologies they'll be developing from the ethical angle, and to ensure that the right kinds of conversations are generated with stakeholders in this technology. So that includes the human rights community. That includes members of other nations, right? So this is not a US-centric effort. That includes the dispossessed and people we may not otherwise think of as being stakeholders in Department of Defense investments. So we're reaching out to those communities to ensure their voices are heard and their concerns are addressed and incorporated sensibly as we develop these programs. Now, to do that, we've had to articulate a framework that helps us capture a lot of the moral and ethical concerns you might have, questions that might be raised as you think about technology development. So I would argue this framework really is informed by, but sets independently of a legal framework, right? So there might be a positive law, for instance, that is not necessarily connected to the moral or ethical issues, again, as Lieutenant Colonel Bolt mentioned. I would argue that at the end of the day, we'll leave that legal review up to the people who have the salient expertise, that the moral and ethical dimensions need to be given equal weight and oftentimes need to lead the way, since at least part of what justifies the law is not merely that it's passed in kind of positive Fullerian sense, but also that it's morally justified, right, by the natural law, by what the dictates of morality have to say about how we ought to treat each other as human beings. So to ensure that we don't leave a stone unturned, we have developed a 3 C's framework. So this is based upon a review of the neuroethics literature. Those 3 C's stand for character, consent, and consequence. And that's our shorthand for making sure we get at the large issues. It's a little bit like the 4 C's framework you use to evaluate a diamond, right? Color, clarity, and chemistry. So we have, character, consent, and consequence. So those 3 dimensions of ethical evaluation are connected to several thousand years of exploration of ethical issues, and especially the Western tradition. Although I would also argue they're consistent with the Eastern tradition as well, and things like Confucianism and Buddhism. So the questions about character speak to Aristotelian and Platonic concerns. Does the development of this science or technology enable us to flourish as human beings? Does its development cause us to exhibit character traits that allow us to function maximally given the environment in which we live? Do those technologies allow us to be more honest, forthright, and courageous, and so on? Think of your canonical virtues from virtue theory that you might remember from a bad philosophy course you took at another university. So those questions of character are critically important and are roughly informed by virtue theoretic considerations like you get out of the Nicomachean Ethics or Plato's Republic. The second set of questions we ask ourselves is, does this science technology, is it conducive to the idea of us being consenting creatures? So generally before I do something to you, I need to get your permission to do it to you. This distinction between those who have consented to be part of an enterprise and those who haven't underlies that discrimination tenet of use in bello that Colonel Bolt mentioned earlier, it's fundamental to the way we think about regulating violence and the ethics of warfare. So that people who are wearing the uniform have consented to be part of the enterprise of warring, and I don't have a claim against you if you shoot me on the battlefield as a result, if I'm wearing a uniform and bearing arms against you. So, that's one example of how questions of consent play out very concretely. And so we need to ask the same questions as we develop neuroscience technology. Is it being used with the consent of all parties involved? There are complicated issues there, right? Because certainly on the battlefield, there's a sense in which I consent to be part of the war. But if you were to ask me, I wouldn't say that, oh, I've consented to be shot today, right? So there are all kinds of complicated issues we need to unpack there, and which we have unpacked in professional military ethics, in part, with theories of combatancy. So that's the second C, very important one, consent. And it is rooted in the philosophies of people like Immanuel Kant and deontology, the rights of persons, not to be treated merely as a means, but always also as an end. The third C is consequence. So think back to the trolley and the footbridge problems, where you probably quickly thought about the consequences of the actions that you were about to take or not to take. So this C is rooted in the good old-fashioned utilitarianism of John Stuart Mill, right? So if you read his book, Utilitarianism, or if you read On Liberty, right, one of the best by my lights, consequence-oriented defenses of the notion of human rights, you'll quickly discover that from either act utility or rule utilitarian perspectives, that there are many ways we regulate our conduct to ensure that the interests of every sentient creature in the world are taken into account. So that's the third C that we consider. What are the consequences of the development of this technology? Now, fortunately, we are not at C in a sieve here. That is, there's a rich body of philosophy that links to issues of military ethics that we can draw upon. I mentioned earlier the combatant, non-combatant distinction. That's so critically important. And so we can draw upon those use ad bellum and use in bello resources as we think about a neuroethics evaluation framework as well. Now, since I'm out of time, I won't talk to you about some of my thoughts of how we develop an equivalent to use ad bellum and use in bello for the regulation of neuroscience technology. For fruitful guidance about how we ought to apply it. I hope that we'll do that during our conversation and discussion. But I will say this, I hope that you can at least see your way through from this 3C's perspective to understand how, understanding something like the neurobiology and psychology of storytelling, so that I can produce a more effective pamphlet to tell people in the Philippines about where they ought to go to receive food aid, or so that I can produce a more effective commercial to air in response to Al-Manar's Hezbollah propaganda that attempts to justify, from a moral perspective, the killing of many innocent people for the achievement of Hezbollah's political objectives. That to be able to speak truth to that kind of cultural power that is wielded there is at least permissible from the moral perspective, and perhaps even morally obligatory. I actually think it is. That is, I think we ought to use words to resolve disagreement whenever we can, rather than bullets and bombs. And that's part of the reason why I can sleep semi-decently at night, being a person of conscience. Of course, I'm aware that there's disagreement about some of the upshot of these technologies. And I hope that you can see your way through to having similar thoughts. Look forward to the conversation. Thank you for having me.
I'm going to talk about things that connect to both what Lieutenant Colonel Bolt talked to you about and what Dr. Casebeer talked to you about, but I'm not going to connect all the dots. But I am going to talk to you about current technology or future technology that we feel needs to be dealt with very adequately through the processes of international law. We feel that it requires new law. And to respond to Colonel Bolt's comment, yes, we are going to call them killer robots, but I do recognize others call them other names. So I'm going to talk to you about a weapon system that has not only not been deployed yet, it actually doesn't exist. And some people would say, well, it's too early to talk about that. You shouldn't be talking about banning a weapon that doesn't exist. My experience, having worked for 30 years now in humanitarian issues, is this is actually the right time to start to talk about issues if we feel there's going to be a problem. You saw earlier a slide with all the different treaties that have banned weapons. We do have experience banning weapons after they've been used and after they've caused problems. And so we know we can do that, but we go through a process of a lot of chaos, a lot of destruction, a lot of death and dismemberment before we get to that point. So if we can not do that, if we think there's going to be concerns, if we can do things that will mitigate those concerns before a weapon is deployed, I think it's a very useful process for us to go through. Certainly from my experience, my organization is now 20 years old. We were founded 20 years ago to work to help change the Canadian government's policy on and position on landmines and to work towards an international ban on landmines, which you know has happened. And one of the lessons I feel we've learned through the Ottawa Treaty process banning anti-personnel landmines is let's not wait until we have an international humanitarian crisis before we deal with it. We have an opportunity now to deal with this before a crisis occurs. And last month in Geneva at the CCW, the acting Deputy General of the UN office in Geneva said something similar to that, and I'll quote him. He says, "All too often, international law only responds to atrocities and suffering once it has happened. You have the opportunity to take preemptive action and ensure that the ultimate decision to end life remains firmly under human control." So I feel that's where we're talking about. Our campaign, 8 organizations got together in October 2012, and we decided that this issue was pressing enough and important enough that we needed to create an international campaign to move forward on it. A month after we decided to create a campaign, Human Rights Watch came out with this report called Losing Humanity, which is the first report or publication I know of, that public publication anyways, that deals with the legal and humanitarian concerns related to fully autonomous weapons. 6 months after we met, we did launch our campaign in London. We now have 51 NGOs in 24 countries, and it's coordinated by Human Rights Watch. Just so you know, the 2 people up there, Jody Williams is the Nobel Peace Laureate, 1997, and she's also a founder of the Nobel Women's Initiative. The other gentleman there is named Noel Sharkey. He's a professor of artificial intelligence and robotics and is a co-founder of the International Committee for Robot Arms Control, which is an organization of scientists, computer scientists, artificial intelligence experts, ethicists, and academics who have a variety of concerns with this kind of technology: moral, ethical, legal, and technical concerns. And in the middle is a robot named David Reckham. He's a British robot. Those of you who like football may understand where his name comes from. And when we launched our campaign, we had a public event outside the British Parliament where David was wandering around talking to passers-by and telling them he was a friendly robot and did not want to be weaponized. The basic element of our campaign is, I think that we feel there is a line that should never be crossed, that we should never cede control or delegate the decision-making to target and kill to a machine. Basically, there's a fundamental line we feel should never be crossed. Oh, sorry. In our campaign, we call them killer robots, but there are many other names that people call them. They're sometimes known as lethal autonomous robots, autonomous weapon systems, lethal autonomous weapon systems, or fully autonomous weapon systems. And I think Colonel Bolt came up with one I hadn't heard this morning, which I think was offensive lethal autonomous, or offensive autonomous weapon systems. There's no agreed terminology yet. I think that's part of the issue, and I think through the process that we are trying to drive, we will start to come to better understandings of what it is we are all talking about and get closer to what the agreed terminology is, and that's going to be a key element of this. Certainly my experience with landmines and clusters and the 2 treaties, a treaty process really helps to bring clarity to what it is we're actually talking about what is even being regulated or banned. And often the definitions are the very last thing you get to. And that's not a bad thing. I'm going to show you a few slides of what we call precursors to fully autonomous weapons. These are weapons that are either in use now or are in demonstration level. These are not the kind of weapons we're talking about, but they give you an idea what the potential is if we take the humans out of the loop or the humans off the loop. So so we're not talking about drones. Drones do have a human in control, and it's worth having discussions about how much and how meaningful that human control is in the case of drones and whether they are actually being used legally. But the weapon itself, or the technology itself, we don't feel is the issue. It's how it may be used that may be the problem with drones. These are two weapons that can fly intercontinental missions. They are in demonstration models. They're obviously designed to be weaponized. And this is one that is being used now in South Korea's border with the DMZ. It's a stable sentry. Oops, sorry, hit the wrong. Oh my, what did I do? All right, so technology is failing me, which is probably one of the reasons why I have issues with technology somewhat. I didn't do that on purpose. Can I do it from the keyboard? All right. Apologies for that. This is another version of robot that's being used. Obviously, to me, this looks like a load-bearing robot, may or may not be weaponized. Obviously, robotics can be used for civilian purposes, and they can be used in military purposes, and we don't have a problem with robots. We can see a lot of very useful uses for them. We do have concerns when they're weaponized, but we really are concerned when they become fully autonomous. And just to give you an idea, there are a number of countries that we know are working on these kind of technologies. It's the US, Britain, Israel, China, Russia, and South Korea. But there may be others we don't know. There's a lot of opacity or not a lot of clarity on this. And they're not all air or land-based. They can also be sea and water-based. And this is another one, a fixed sentry. This is more an automated system. Again, we're not generally concerned about automated systems like this. They work under constrained or limited parameters. Usually you're dealing with an incoming missile that requires a very quick turnaround. There's almost always a manual override to this. There may be issues with some of these weapons, but I'm not sure that we would be focusing on them as bannable weapons. So that's not what we're talking about. Usually these precursors, the things they have in common is that there's a human in the loop, which means that a human is controlling the system, probably through a monitoring system, satellites and monitors. Or there's a human on the loop, which basically means they have a period of time to override a decision that the machine might be taking. Again, the amount of time that is required perhaps is debatable. I'm assuming through the Article 36 processes, that would be one of the issues they would look at, is that time sufficient? But again, humans in the loop, humans on the loop are not necessarily an issue for us. It's when there's no human involved, no meaningful human control, that we have our concerns. Now, those who are proponents of these systems, who would not call them killer robots, they would call them autonomous weapon systems or fully autonomous weapon systems, make these basic points of why these are useful things to pursue, useful to develop. I think all those points are worthy of discussion. I think they're all debatable, but that doesn't mean that if we have a comprehensive and thorough discussion about this, we may agree that some of these things are really worth pursuing, and there may be other ways we can deal with this. But I think the main thing that has come out to me in the last 2 years now, a year and a half that we've been working on this, is there's general consensus that these weapons are a game changer. This is going to change fundamentally the nature of conflict and war. And I think it's very important for us as societies to really unpack that and understand what that means, not just from a military perspective, but how it's actually going to affect us legally, in our lifestyles, how we go about our daily lives. Is this the future we want? It may be the future we can have, but that doesn't necessarily mean we have to have it. We have the choice of what we want. So we need to really understand this. If this changes the nature of warfare, what does that mean for us, both militarily, but also as functioning democratic societies? As a campaign, we have a variety of concerns. We have moral, ethical, legal, technical, and policy concerns on this. There are also military and cultural concerns. I'll touch on all these, or most of these, briefly, but I'll try and focus a bit more on the moral, legal, and ethical concerns. These are some of the technical issues or concerns that the U.S. and its Department of Defense directive came up with, possible issues around this kind of technology. This directive is probably the closest thing there is in the world right now to a national policy. And it's actually a very good directive in many ways. One of the things we wish it was actually a lot firmer. It can be very easily overridden by a commander if these weapons were in use. But this is a good starting point for our discussions, and I think we should commend the U.S. for their transparency and their openness on this issue, and wish that more governments would actually act like that. Obviously, there are a lot of other concerns that we have with this. Some of them are, what is actually driving these decisions? Is it military needs, military imperative for the way the conflict is going to be fought in the future, or the way conflict is fought now? Or are there other reasons why these technologies are being developed? I think that's a real major concern. And certainly the technology people in our campaign are very concerned about the hacking, the jamming, the spoofing, and other ways to decoy or take over the technology. That's a major issue. As well as, can you actually create the software? Can you write enough software code to have these machines comply with existing international humanitarian law or existing international human rights law, let alone what may be required in the future? These are just some of the legal concerns. There's not all, there's a long list of them. As I think I just mentioned, there are human rights concerns and there's humanitarian law concerns, or some call them the law of war. I'm more familiar with the IHL approach, but there are a lot of concerns in the human rights community about this, and this issue is being discussed both in the Human Rights Council and in the Convention on Conventional Weapons right now in Geneva. I think everybody generally has agreed. The ICRC convened a meeting of experts in March 2014 to talk about this, and there was general understanding that these machines have to comply with and are under the direction of international law. The question is, can they actually comply with what exists now? And the fact that there will be no humans involved in the decision to target and to attack, which is not something that was ever envisioned in the creation of existing IHL, does that require the fact that we actually need new law to address that issue? There are a couple other things that aren't on there. I think one, I don't know if you've covered the Martens Clause in the course, or if you understood it, but the public conscience and the principles of humanity are issues that are really important to understand here. And also at the ICRC event, a lot of people, or a number of people, raised the issue that how people are killed actually matters. Even if they are lawful targets, it's a matter of respect for human dignity. The decisions to take someone's life must remain with humans. And one of the things that has struck me is when we first started the campaign one of the first things I read was from a high-ranking U.S. general who said that death by machine would be the ultimate indignity. And that just is something that stays with me. But I think it's an example of the fact that people do have a very visceral reaction to this issue. When you talk about machines who are able to attack and target you and make the decision themselves. We call it the ick factor. And people are, oh, that's just disgusting. Why would anybody envision that? Just a little anecdote, last month in the CCW when they were discussing this, the UN translators had problems with the ick factor, so that it's now seems to be called the UG factor, which seemed to be the common terminology that the translators came up with. But there is a real serious public reaction to this, and I think that needs to be understood. And I think when countries do Article 36 assessments, I'm hoping that they also take the public conscience and the dictates of humanity into consideration. Okay. These are some of the ethical and moral issues that we raise. Obviously, the biggest one is it right for humans to cede the decision to target and kill to machines? It's the really big fundamental issue. But there are a variety of other issues. Whether or not a machine can actually act ethically, it would be an issue. And it was, one of the things that proponents say is that you can take the emotion out of the equation. So you don't have revenge, you don't have overreaction. And that may be true if that's technically possible, but I'm not sure it's necessarily a good thing. One of the things you find with studies that are done with soldiers who have been in combat is that they are very resistant to take another life. They will do a lot not to take another life. And sometimes they will actually be killed themselves because they just are uncomfortable with taking another life. And I think one of the things that has prevented a lot of cruelty and unnecessary suffering in conflict has been the fact that they're humans and they have limited themselves, they have controlled themselves. So I think that that emotional factor, human emotions, are actually an important inhibitor to killing people unlawfully or needlessly. So I think that is something that we would not necessarily want to take out of the equation. We also have proliferation concerns. I think if you think of any weapon that's in use right now, one side had it first, very quickly everybody wants it. And it's very quick to get them. I mean, landmines are an example of very simple technology used in almost half the countries in the world. Most militaries had them, whether they are regular forces or whether they are non-state or irregular forces, they had them. Nuclear weapons, which is probably the most sophisticated weapon ever designed. One country has it, now there are 8 or 9 or 10, depending on how you count. Other sides will get it. They may be people we don't want to have this weapon. Terrorist groups, criminal elements, non-state actors. Whatever technological advantage there might be for the first side that has this weapon, it'll be short-lived. And that means that you have the potential for what we call a robot arms war, which we don't think is a particularly desirable thing. These are some concerns that military themselves have raised. They're not concerns that we as humanitarian organizations have raised, but military themselves have. One of the things that often surprises people when I talk to them about my work with landmines and clusters is the fact that we work very closely with military personnel around the world. Some of our best allies are military personnel. You should never think about a military, and you should never think about governments either, as monolithic entities. There are people who will share our views, our analysis, our desires in all those bodies. And these are some of the issues that some of the military personnel raised. That University of Massachusetts poll is an interesting one. That's the only poll I've known so far that's been done in the world. They polled 1,000 people. More than 2/3 of the people responded said they were opposed to the weapon, but the biggest group of people who were opposed to the weapon, the development of this technology, were serving military personnel, families of serving military personnel, or retired military personnel. And I think that comes from the ethics and the morality that our forces personnel have. my experience, we have in Canada, and I suspect the same is true in the United States, highly trained military personnel. And they're not there to cause disruption and harm for innocent civilians. They're not there to kill wantonly. They are there to do a job. Sometimes it's a very dirty job, but they are to do it in the best way possible with the least disruption and death and dismemberment that is possible. And I think that's a very important thing for us to consider. And I think it's one of the reasons why we will be able to move forward on this issue and have moved forward quickly on this, is there is a lot of military concerns about this issue. Is this actually what we need? Is this the weapon that is actually going to help military personnel deal with conflicts in the future? And I think there's a lot of questions about that. We have a very simple call to action. We just think there needs to be a preemptive ban on the development, production, and use of fully autonomous weapons. And we think that's best done by an international treaty, but also we think national policies and national laws are essential as well. There are discussions going on now, as I said, in two different fora within UN. The Convention on Conventional Weapons, which had 4 days of talks last month in Geneva on this, following, I think it was 3 days of talks last November. These are what they call informal talks, but they're just starting to share countries' views on this, getting people to start to talk. They have a lot of experts there, military and robotics and ethical and experts. So it was a really interesting, widespread discussion to get everybody starting at some form of common understanding and some common area where we can discuss the issue. There were no governments anywhere within the CCW. I think there's 112 states to the CCW, states parties, who opposed having these discussions. There were 5 countries at that meeting that called for an outright ban, so that has already started, and there was widespread discussion that went on. The CCW is important because it actually has created one of the few, if not the only, international instrument that bans a weapon before it was used. It's the Protocol on Blinding Laser Weapons, known as CCW Protocol 4. And a key element in this was actually discussions around the Martens Clause, around public dictates and public conscience. And this was a process that has an interesting history. We've written a paper on this in MAC, which you can get on our website. Sweden was the country that really started this, and they went on for a long time trying to raise this and weren't getting any traction. And then eventually the ICRC joined in, Human Rights Watch, and some other NGOs. And they started to discuss this in the CCW 20 years ago. And at that time, the US and China were the two countries that were the farthest along in the development of the weapon. And all the states started to think, well, this is just not good. I mean, yes, if we have this weapon, we can blind their soldiers. But if they have the weapon, they can blind our soldiers. And very likely out of that is we're going to blind civilians as well, because who knows how the technology will get used. And they eventually, through this discussion, came around to the point that actually none of us want this to happen. So the US and China, which were the farthest ahead, said, yeah, we think this would be an advantage to us to have this, but obviously it's going to be short term, and the weapon itself seems to be problematic enough that maybe none of us should have it. And I think that's a really good precedent that has been set, and I think it's worthwhile that we continue to pursue other ones. CCW will decide in November whether it's going to continue these discussions. It may continue under the existing mandate of informal experts meetings. It may decide there's not enough agreement, because it does work under consensus, which in Geneva or UN terms means one country can veto it. Or they may change the mandate. They may have a more formal mandate, and they may even go towards a negotiating mandate. They will have a review conference of the convention in 2016. That's usually the time when they make decisions on whether or not they are going to create new protocols, and we think that would be a very appropriate time to have a new law. It's also being discussed in the Human Rights Council. It's going to be discussed there next week. Professor Christoph Heinz, who's a South African lawyer, he's the UN Special Rapporteur on extrajudicial, summary, and arbitrary killings, has written a very interesting and profound report where he has called for a moratorium on the development of these weapons, but he has said that this should be worked in, this technology should be discussed both under IHL and under human rights law, and he has recommended that the Human Rights Council remain seized with these issues because it has potential implications to human rights, especially the right to life and dignity. Other organizations, major human rights organizations that you know, Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, have also just recently released reports where they have major concerns about the human rights elements of the use of this technology in crowd control or in policing. Human Rights Council works in a very different way, and maybe John can tell us how this works. I'm not an expert in Human Rights Council, so it's a little harder for me to understand how it will work, but there's usually a resolution that comes out of it that goes back to the UN General Assembly, and that may happen next month or it may happen over the summer, I'm not sure. I'm getting near the end. So far, there have been 44 countries that have spoken out on this issue. As I said earlier, the US is the only one that has an articulated policy. That's not a bad thing. I think it's really good that most countries have not yet got national policies on this. This is a new issue. It's new for everybody, not just for us, but for governments. It's new for many militaries. I think this offers us an opportunity to have a really comprehensive dialogue at national levels as well as international levels to see what it is we want, what it is we don't want. Where our areas of commonality are and where our areas of concern are. There are good possibilities here, and there is interesting potential. But I like to think that one of the byproducts of our campaign is that we are forcing governments around the world to address this issue, even though they may not want to. Many of them have other preoccupations, but this technology is coming fast. 10 years ago, nobody talked about drones. Now everybody talks about drones. They're widely used in civilian purposes, but they're also being increasingly used in military purposes. This technology will come quickly. We don't have time to really say, no, it's numbers 86 on our list of national priorities. We really need to have the capacity to deal with this, and I think civil society, militaries, and governments working together, we can come up with something that is really useful. For those of you who are not with the military or government, we have a petition which we call Keep Killer Robots Fiction, which I think may explain our position. I would encourage you to join that. I think our view is it's clear that existing law is important. These weapons are under existing law, but because of the actual nature of the weapons, we think new law is required to strengthen existing IHL and strengthen existing human rights law to ensure that if these technologies are ever used, we understand what will happen and they will have limits on them. I think the Canadian Red Cross used to have a slogan, I don't know if you still do, Catherine, which even wars have limits. It's something I think is a very profound statement, and I think it's something that really should underpin a lot of our work. And as we commemorate this year the 100th anniversary of the First World War, the war that was supposed to end all wars, and today when we're marking the 70th anniversary of D-Day, the second Great War, the one that followed the war that didn't end all wars, through those two wars and the subsequent conflicts we've seen, we can see that conflict and the nature of war has changed dramatically. It is civilians that are often the victims, vastly the victims. 98% of the known victims of cluster munitions were civilians. Victims are often now the target in combat. Terrorizing communities seems to be the way that people feel they can make political or military gains. So I think it's very important for us in this time when we are reflecting on those things to think about what it is we are willing to accept in the future. Killer robots can be part of our future. I don't think they should be. But I encourage you to think about that very carefully, and I encourage all of us to try and come up those of us who are Canadians, but I also very much appreciated your presentations on the morality and the ethical thinking that's going on in the work in DARPA. I think it's important for all of us to really unpack these things, discuss them fully. Let's not rush into anything, but most importantly, let's not sleepwalk our way into a future we don't want. We can stop it if we feel it's important to do so. I think it is, and I would encourage you to work on this, and I'm looking forward to the discussion after. Thank you.